Hello. Okay. So information processing. We look at this in terms of, again, like a computer, information processing looks at the brain like a computer, and it's the things that it does: input, memory, what is it? Retrieval. See, I'm getting older. Retrieval, all of these things, and output. So let's look at them one by one. Okay. So input, the brain receives information via senses. That's the first thing that happens in information processing. We receive information. It comes through via our senses into the thalamus, where it's sort of sent out to the different sensory places that it needs to go. We know that senses decline in late adulthood, and I don't think that's any shock, right? Our vision gets worse, hearing gets worse. Yes, younger people can wear hearing aids, but it's mostly going to be older people. And reading glasses, I've just gotten there recently. It's very sad. I mean, I've had LASIK, but I still have glasses, and I'm getting into the reading glasses world. So vision goes down. These things, they just reduce. And so we have different things, hearing aids and so forth, that can help with like severe losses in those areas, potentially, hopefully, if they're not too severe. But there are more subtle ones that can impair cognition. And I find this really interesting, the whole idea that, it's our sensory processing that allows us to read nonverbal cues a lot, nonverbal communication. How do we read emotions in other people? We've talked about this. So tone of voice, the look in their eyes and their facial expressions and the way they hold themselves. All of these things are what allow especially that right amygdala and the right brain to read that input and understand it in a very social and emotional way. Well, if the ability to sense those things has gone down, then your ability to read emotions and and social information also goes down. And I think that's really important to keep in mind when we're dealing with older people. Because if you think about it, if you can't see somebody's facial expressions as well, then you're not going to be able to read when they're upset or how they're dealing with what you're telling them. And if you can't hear the tone of their voice or the tone of your voice maybe as well either, you're just not able to read this information and process these things as well, then this can get in the way of interactions and social interactions. And honestly, as hearing can go down and maybe people don't, interaction altogether can go down because it's harder. It's harder. And if people on the other side don't understand what's maybe happening, it's harder. There's a study that showed greater percentage of cognitive decline over an 11-year period for older adults who had greater hearing loss. So the greater the hearing loss, the greater the cognitive decline. And those that didn't have any hearing loss, they didn't see near as much. Now, they saw cognitive decline. And if you look, it says only, I think it's a 3% difference, but over, when you look at that across the population, that's actually pretty significant. So we can see how this can translate into other areas. And if you're not hearing, if you're not intaking information, then you're not processing it, you're not using those parts of your brain as much, and things are going to decline. And remember, the brain is a use it or lose it kind of mechanism. Even small input loss can have impact on output. Sorry, very thirsty. So memory comes next once there's input, processing what comes in through the senses. So stereotype threat, I thought it was interesting how we even talk about this. So the idea again that I'm getting senile, I can't remember things, I'm getting older, I'll have memory loss, can cause anxiety, and stress itself can help deplete memory, can be a factor in depleting memory. So, because when the stress response system gets going, systems just don't work as well. So thinking we're old can impede health and memory. More explicit memory loss than implicit. So it seems to be, and that can be hippocampal loss. Remember, the hippocampus is definitely needed for explicit memory. Harder to remember names than actions. Like I can, somebody might be able to remember how to ride a bike, but they can't, now their physical body might not let them do it as well. They can remember how to do it. They might remember how to cook a meal that they like, but not be able to remember like a name. Like those things go first, it seems. Source amnesia, where info came from. Interesting that, so older people may not be able to remember, and especially in our world today with technology, did they get this information from the internet or the radio or the television or the news, or where did this social media, where did this information come from? And can actually tend to make us more gullible, maybe, because we just assume it to be true because we remember it without considering the source as much. Prospective memory, which is our future intention. So I have a lunch date. I'm supposed to call so-and-so. I need to get this done. I need to turn off the stove in 10 minutes. That tends to go down. So working memory, and that, I think prospective memory and working memory and processing speed can all go together to some extent. So working memory, that chalkboard in the mind where you take in, so if somebody asks you to lunch and you say yes, but then you don't write it down in a place where you're definitely going to see it, then if the working memory isn't as strong, it's just not going to stay. It's not going to go into where you can recall that information. And then also with processing speed, so if it takes longer, so if you are given some information, a phone number that you need to remember, but your ability to hold it long enough has declined, then your ability to process it has declined too. Maybe you can't hold it long enough to process it. So all of these things can kind of work together to create a cognitive decline. And we know that a lot of this is fluid intelligence, which we just see in the decline. We don't see as much of the decline in remembering vocabulary words or being able to, so when we read, to be able to comprehend things. Those things don't tend to leave us as much. Control processes are also a part of information. So early on, when memory was a subject, we like metacognition, to think about thinking, to be able to analyze your thinking and determine if it was good thinking that led you to certain action. So these are executive functions, the ability to hone in on specific information, selective attention, to be able to then say, well, what do I need to know? What have I done in the past? What decisions have I made around this particular thing? To be able to control the input, the flow of input that we get, what we focus our attention on, how we judge it, do we analyze it, and then take action based on everything we know around it. So a lot of that's executive functioning and the control processes of our systems. So many researchers believe this is the crucial loss in late adulthood. Older adults tend to make choices based on past experience and current emotion, rather than that metacognition, that thinking about their thinking. So if we have retrieval problems, like if we have working memory, or our hippocampus to turn things into long memory isn't working as well, or the ability to just recall things, that processing speed, to process things, to be able to bring them up in memory, to really be able to hold on to them, to use that information to make new choices. We just can't compare and analyze. That's deep thinking. Deep thinking is that ability to say, well, I've done this in the past. Look what I did. See, to see all these different things in play and then make choices, analyze that. Logically and all of this. So it's a little bit like younger people, when we talk about younger people though, past experience can just be implicit to some extent. Habits of thinking, habits of doing things, the way we do them, the way I've always done them, just do them the way I've always done them. And then current emotion, if I'm upset or I'm happy or whatever, we make a little bit different decision than if we're really using more of the analytical functions that we have. So, and older adults can be resistant to learning new strategies. Some of that goes with that stereotype threat. I'm old, I'm just declining, forget it, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, and all of this. Output is how all this information gets expressed. In daily interactions, that's often verbal, how we communicate with people. And again, with sense, you have to remember all of this kind of in working together. So if your senses are going, you don't see as well, you don't hear as well, maybe you can't think as quickly. So you're in a room with a bunch of maybe younger people and they're having these very fast, fluid conversations. It doesn't mean you don't understand them or you can't, but one thing is if they're talking really fast, your ability to catch it, to hold it in memory and process it isn't going to be. So you may not catch everything they say. And if you can't hear it as well, you won't. And so these things happen, but it doesn't mean if people talked slower or if you were listening to something, if you and if an older person and a younger person are listening to something and it's done at a speed, like the younger person can process it more quickly, but it doesn't mean they can process it better necessarily or understand it better. It just means that they can process it better and give their output faster. So older people with some of these deficits talk less, interact less, because the people around them aren't listening or aren't slowing down or aren't allowing for their processing speed or aren't allowing for what, it doesn't mean that their brain can't work. It just means that it takes more time sometimes. The Seattle Longitudinal Study, which was discussed in Adulthood, all 5 primary abilities that they tested, which were vocabulary recognition, inductive reasoning, spatial orientation. I'm trying to remember all of them. There were 5. They're in there. They're in the book. I should have written them down. See, my memory's going. Declined after 60, particularly processing speed and spatial perception. So that goes with the driving in older people. And the vision is going to be. So some of those things are declining. So normed, but that specific study was normed via younger adults, using younger adults as the norm. So of course they're not going to look as capable. And it focused on fluid intelligence. So the question becomes, is this a fair way to test the intelligence of older adults? Not, yeah, are they having declines, but their intelligence. Is it fair if you're norming it around something that we have some very primary things happening, primary aging things happening? So there's an idea of ecological validity. What about if we measure abilities in everyday settings? So, I like the idea of it being like if you test an older person at 8 a.m. rather than at 4, they do better because their circadian rhythms are very different than adolescents who aren't even up until noon. So would do better at 4. But older people, theirs are different. And so they're up earlier and they go to bed later and they're sharper at 8. So if you took those kinds of things into account, if you looked at what are they motivated to remember? What's important? I think as we age again, is sort of that select, we become more specialists. We don't have room and time for all of it. And so, our brain carries and holds on to what we pay attention to. And as we get older, I think we just sort of focus on very certain things, especially for older adults. As their world, when we're little, we watch like a child's world expand. And I think as we age, sometimes, especially when we get way into later adulthood, our world shrinks again to the people right around us, the people most important to us. So if we're motivated to remember somebody's birthday or, the things that count to us, maybe not some random phone number, but we certainly can remember somebody's phone number that we care about or love, in order to wish them a happy birthday and what's their experience has been. And so how do we begin to really look at the intelligence of older people in a way that's fair, maybe? All right, so we're going to look at neurocognitive disorders. So the DSM-5 has replaced the word dementia, which is anything with sort of a pathological loss of brain function, with neurocognitive disorders, or NCD. And this can include mild and major impairment, can fall under this. How do they test for it? Measurement tests, biomarkers, things found in the blood, in the fluid of the brain, as well as things found in brain scans, and then the clinical judgment of a doctor. So, but you can have things that show up in tests, you kind of have to take a whole picture and a whole look and look at all of these things over time to really know what's going on. There was a study that found that 14% or 4 million of Americans over 70, and this was taken from representative sample across the U.S., have a major impairment. 14% of those over 70, so have some type of major impairment. But it's still a significant number. And yet I think that we tend to think that everybody over 70 is going to have some sort of major impairment. And that's not necessarily the case. But let's look at some of the specific impairments. So Alzheimer's disease, of course. In 1906, Dr. Alois Alzheimer discovered unusual material in the brain during an autopsy on a patient. So he had found, as I talked about just, in the other screencast, he had found those plaques, those clumps of beta amyloid that were in a tissue surrounding the neurons. Those are those clumps. So he found those plaques, and that was kind of our first, and people sort of started, his colleagues believed that he had found some major disease or some component of a disease and named it after him. Some with Alzheimer's have many tangles. So here's the thing. Older people without Alzheimer's have plaques and tangles. But if you have Alzheimer's, you have many plaques and many tangles. So it's amount of number, not just whether they're present or not. And again, we don't know if they are cause or symptom. So they may come, you may have more, but if you have more, or if you have some, but that you don't have Alzheimer's, if you'd lived longer, would you have more? That's to be determined. Tangles are twisted masses of threads of a protein tau. I don't know if it's said the same as like the Dow. Anyway, Dow, within neurons. These are both of these, not just the tangles, are especially found in the hippocampus. So if you think about memory, hippocampus and memory are especially, short-term memory that turns into long-term memory. So also found in cognitively normal adults. So we don't know how that. And people with 1E4, so remember I talked about the AOE gene, E gene, the one with E4, which is the one that has the most potential of getting disease, have a 50-50 chance of developing Alzheimer's. Okay, so another neurocognitive disorder other than AD, Alzheimer's disease, is vascular NCD, which is stroke or a series of strokes. We see this happen. Somebody can have certainly a very large stroke that can be detrimental and, cause disrepair or even death. But some people also often, it's like little strokes, and sometimes you don't even know that they've had them. So these like mini strokes or strokes of any kind, they reduce oxygen to the brain and destroy a part of it because it's an obstruction of a blood vessel in the brain. So there's less oxygenated blood, less oxygen in the brain, and that of course then kills off some of the cells in the brain. Symptoms: slurred speech, blurred vision, paralyzed limbs, mental confusion. Can look in many different ways depending on the part of the brain that it's in and which part of it it's going to impact. The mini stroke symptoms can kind of come and then go quickly, so they can sometimes not even be noticed. But the problem then becomes it can, excuse me, sorry, brief pause there. So I think I was just saying that these mini stroke symptoms can come and go, and sometimes people don't even know they've had them until you begin to, if another one comes, which is probably very likely if it's not treated, it can create what we call vascular dementia. So there's just continual damage happening to the brain, and you begin to see over time certainly those symptoms. I have a friend whose mother had mini strokes like years before, and they didn't even notice, but she did notice changes in her personality quite a bit. So, these things can happen. It's good to be aware of any kind of little changes, especially in anybody, but in these older people when this can happen. So this vascular dementia is actually more common than Alzheimer's, and it also correlates with the E4 allele. So then we have frontal lobe disorders, and 15% of those neurocognitive disorders in the U.S. are these frontal lobe disorders, more likely to occur under 70. So younger people than 70 get these more often than they get Alzheimer's or the vascular disorders. Frontal lobe disorders impact emotional centers. So we're looking at the limbic system, the amygdala, and parts of the prefrontal cortex that are involved in assessing emotions, and also in a lot of those cognitive, social cognition emotions, but also we know that things like compassion, empathy, take part a great deal in the very prefrontal cortex, back in here, the insula and the ACC. Also, the prefrontal cortex inhibits the amygdala. So if that happens, if there's some damage in there and that ability to regulate, we see personality and emotional changes. So people can kind of lose compassion, self-awareness, judgment, all of those areas that we talk about with meditation and mindfulness. So here's another reason to practice those in terms of, maintaining our brain and our health. That these are potentially places that can get damaged over time, and with stress, I think, quite a bit too. So there's many forms and causes, a dozen or so alleles. Keeping in mind when it talks about genetics, though, keeping in mind epigenetics, that very few things, just because you even have the genetics for Alzheimer's doesn't guarantee you get it. Because so most of this stuff is epigenetic, in terms of how does the environment and other factors contribute to the turning on and off of those genes. So the more we can do things that create density in these areas of the brain and activity in these areas of the brain, the better we are off. So this one, the frontal lobe disorders do progress rapidly. They death in approximately 5 years. And I think my friend's mother may have had something like this, because these are this kind of changes, and within that 5 years, she did die. So, okay, so there's other disorders. Parkinson's disease. 3% of NCDs are Parkinson's. We see that rigidity or tremor of muscles. We hear a lot about Parkinson's these days. That there's a degeneration of dopamine-producing neurons. So Parkinson's is a lot about lessening dopamine. And it affects movement before it affects cognition, though. I have a friend whose brother has this, and I think his cognition is just still fine. We see Michael J. Fox with this. Cognition, to our eyes at least, is fine. Yet there's a lot of movement issues. Lewy bodies is abnormal deposits of the protein alpha-synuclein, which are called Lewy bodies. The deposits, these abnormal deposits are called Lewy bodies. The protein isn't. It's also present in Parkinson's, but they're more numerous and widespread in the brain in this particular disorder. Inhibition seems to be definitely fades. And this is what Robin Williams had, or at least what we're being told he had in some ways. We thought that it was heavy-duty depression. And of course, many of these things become comorbid, that when people lose capacities that they've had all their lives, and when their brain is affected as well as their body, yes, depression can set in, and those things can become comorbid. So, and I think he had a history of that. But to find out that he also had this, and that this can cause all kinds of different mental changes as well, delusions and ideas and things like that. Comorbidity is very common among all of these. People with Lewy bodies have, maybe have the Parkinson's, or with Alzheimer's can have other forms of NCD. So we don't always, it's not just one or the other. Depression or anxiety in our older adults, it's certainly reversible. It's one of the, but there's an ongoing increased risk when we have depression of some of these other things. So in our younger years, to just be aware, to do something about our wellness and our well-being. Stop waiting for the time that's going to come later, when everything we're doing now for our body and our brain impacts what it looks like later, and how well we can do it based on our capacities in our brain and our body. So what are the preventions? Exercise, medications that as we age might help with certain deficits, avoiding certain pathogens. And what about the mind? So of course I've talked about mindfulness, and I feel very strongly about that. Also, there is a study that Sean Aker talked about, and talks about in his book, The Happiness Advantage. If you watch the TED Talk I had placed up a while ago, he did. But he's out of Harvard. And he discusses a study that was done where they took, I'm going to paraphrase all of it, and I don't, have it all. If I can find a report on it, I will post it. But that just talks about how they took older people in their 70s and they put them, I think it might have been an outside of Big Sur or something. Anyway, they put them in a retreat for a while. But the retreat was like everything was as it would have been when they were in, like, I believe their 20s or 30s. So they took them back to an entirely different time of life. That means the music, the clothes they wore, the way they were supposed to speak. They were told, encouraged, to think about and talk and live basically as it would have been at that time in their lives. The news, everything they were exposed to, everything externally that they were exposed to would take their memory back to that generation, to that decade, to that time in their life. And then the way they spoke to each other and what they talked about and all of that. And of course, they took all their biomarkers before this and cognitive tests and all of these things before. And then they did it after. And it was really interesting because they saw like significant changes in their biomarkers, their physiology, the way they held themselves, their cognitive tests, everything. And so this goes to that stereotype threat. And this whole idea of the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about aging, what we expect. And so if it also just gives us the power of the mind. What happens if we don't allow ourselves to, to just assume and live out in anything in our lives some type of stereotype threat we have about ourselves. And so I think that's just a really, really important thing to remember, that goes with age, it goes with gender, it goes with ethnicity, it goes with pretty much, all of those kinds of things. What we think about ourselves, what we think we expect to come and to happen, gets created based upon the way we use our mind and the way we hold our body. So anyway, just want you to think about that. So that's all I'm doing on this part. And then we'll talk next week. Take care.